This presentation will focus on John Rawls' 1971 book, A Theory of Justice, in which he lays out an argument for distributive justice. I will focus specifically on sections 24, 25, 26, and 29. In these sections, Rawls details the assumptions he makes about individuals in the original position, which is the starting point for his theory of justice as fairness. Section 24 is called the veil of ignorance. In Rawls' original position, individuals are understood to be agreeing to a system of justice as fairness from a position of neutrality, which Rawls calls the veil of ignorance. Essentially, the veil allows rational people to fairly agree to a cooperative system whose basic institutions are grounded in the two principles of justice Rawls believes people in this position would agree to. Behind the veil of ignorance, there are many things individuals do not know about themselves and others. These are things like which generation they belong to, what their talents or preferences are, what their personality is like, where in history their society is, any defining socioeconomic features like gender, race, occupation, religious affiliation, etc. Rawls also talks about what people do know about themselves and others from behind the veil. Rawls says that individuals have a basic understanding of economic and political systems in psychology and that their society is based in the quote-unquote circumstances of justice. In addition, individuals understand that once they come out from behind the veil, they will have goals and values and a plan of life. Section 25 is called the rationality of the parties, and in it, Rawls describes how individuals behind the veil of ignorance are mutually disinterested. Quoting Rawls, quote, "While they know that they have some rational plan of life, they do not know the details of this plan, the particular ends and interests which it is calculated to promote," end quote. They also know everyone else shares this circumstance and that people will value things differently. Helpful to think of this visually. Imagine that any person, because this would apply to anyone behind the veil, has what Rawls calls a conception of the good, represented by X. Once this person is out from behind the veil, they will try to achieve X by using Z, Y, and B, which represent different socioeconomic advantages and circumstances. The order in which they value Z, Y, and B and the degree to which they value each will be different. Another key assumption Rawls makes about the rationalities of individuals behind the veil is that they are mutually disinterested. While he does assume that people have an inherent inclination to care about each other to some extent, which I'll elaborate on later, Rawls says that behind the veil, people do not feel competitive with others or compare their goals because, after all, they don't know them yet. In sections 24 and 25, Rawls talks about some advantages of the idea of the veil of ignorance and why he uses it in his theory. I should also mention that behind the veil, people know that themselves and everyone else will not only live in the circumstances of justice, but also that they will abide by them. This is because the original position and veil of ignorance imagine fair circumstances, which prevents bias in formulating principles of justice. Another key point is that the things people do not know behind the veil of ignorance are things Rawls asserts are morally ambiguous and thus irrelevant from the standpoint of justice. Rawls believes that the burdens and advantages of living cooperatively will only be distributed fairly if they are not subject to the influence of such arbitrary factors in theory or practice. Section 26 is called the reasoning leading to the two principles of justice. A main focus of this section is Rawls' idea of the Maximin rule. Essentially, the Maximin rule is how people make decisions in the original position. It requires that people compare the worst outcomes of different choices or systems and make a final choice that supports the worst outcomes with the most utility. The Maximin rule can be thought of as leading to the second principle of justice, which includes the idea that as long as the system of distribution of inequalities is set up so the least advantaged benefit the most from the distribution, the inequality can exist in a just society. Choosing what I'll call the best-worst outcome using the Maximin rule begets this. In addition to the Maximin rule as a guiding principle in the original position, Rawls puts forth a few others in Section 26. For one, individuals hypothetically choosing a system of justice as the basis of society need to take into account that future generations must have efficacy in an understanding of their institutions and the hypothetical choices that created them. One of the most important assumptions Rawls makes in Section 26 about human nature as he justifies the second principle of justice and the way that people would arrive at this principle in the original position is his belief that individuals are not inclined to want more advantages than they need or that are fair. This is absolutely essential to his theory. Next, we will discuss Section 29, which is called Some Main Grounds for the Two Principles of Justice. In this chapter, Rawls emphasizes how essential the principles are, as well as the importance of fraternity and public belief in basic institutions as distributing burdens and advantages justly in theory and in practice. As stated earlier, Rawls believes that humans, to some extent, have a natural inclination to value one another. He calls this fraternity. In section 29, Rawls states, quote, "A desirable feature of a conception of justice is that it should publicly express men's respect for one another," end quote. Not only do people inherently value each other, but the fact that they know this is important to creating a just society. Rawls also talks about his concept of publicity in this section. He states, quote, "A conception of justice is stable when the public recognition of its realization by the social system tends to bring about the corresponding sense of justice," end quote. By this he means that the circumstances of the original position lead everyone to have the same sense of justice, even if they have different personal goals. Another way that Rawls describes the sort of trust built in the original position is through his assertion that decisions made behind the veil of ignorance, because they come from a position of equality, inherently make individuals treat one another as ends rather than means. This is an argument Rawls uses to critique utilitarianism and to distinguish his theory from it. Let's do some quick recap. In sections 24 and 25, Rawls lays out the conditions of the original position behind the veil of ignorance, demonstrating that it is a state of equality among rational and mutually disinterested individuals who, given these conditions, agree to the two principles of justice. In section 26, Rawls introduces the Maximin rule, which argues that individuals in the original position will make choices based on differences between the worst possible outcomes of various options. They will choose the best worst outcome, the one that has the most utility. He also argues that humans by nature are not inclined to want more than they need or which is fair. In section 29, Rawls discusses the importance of people's inherent sense of justice for themselves and applied to others. He also emphasizes the importance of public efficacy in the guiding principles of justice within a society. Overall, in the 4 sections discussed, Rawls fleshes out his earlier description of the original position and why it leads to his 2 principles of justice.